Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne. This is a fully independent podcast funded only by the support of listeners and viewers. Also, it's not an echo chamber, so you'll find all different kinds of views here. Visit the website aroundtheempire.com to find out how to support the podcast, gain access to bonus content, and to find the different platforms. This is a panel discussion about the protests and political crisis in Iraq and the Iran deal, the JCPOA. On this panel is Elijah Magnier, Kyle Anzalone, Dan Wright, and myself. Elijah Magnier is a veteran war correspondent and a political analyst with over 35 years of experience covering the Middle East and North Africa. Kyle Anzalone is the opinion editor at antiwar.com, the news editor of Libertarian Institute, and the co-host of the Conflicts of Interest podcast. Dan Wright is a writer and a podcaster and the co-founder of Around the Empire. We did this show as a live stream on August 31st, 2022. Welcome to Around the Empire. On our panel today, we are happy to have Elijah Magnier speaking to us from Europe, Kyle Anzalone out in Colorado, and Dan and I are here on the East Coast, the very hot East Coast right now. Hey everybody, how you doing?
Hello, Joanne.
Great to see you, Elijah. It's been a while, and we're so happy to have you. So today we thought we would talk about the crisis in Iraq, but honestly, we'd like to talk to you about, any discussion about things in the region. As I said, it's been a while since we've gotten your news and updates and your views on the whole thing. But I guess we should start with Iraq. There have been a lot of developments over the past, I guess now, 36 hours when Muqtada al-Sadr announced that he was going to resign from politics. Now, there have been political problems for quite a while. Right, Elijah? I mean, since the election last year. So maybe if you could sort of give us your take on what you saw happen.
Thank you. So what happened is 10 months ago, there were an early election declared by Prime Minister Mustafa Kazimi, and that is for a specific reason. In 2020, when Mustafa Kazimi was elected, he was elected for very specific targets. First, the withdrawal of the US forces from Iraq. Second, to run an early parliamentary elections. And because Brigadier General Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian RGC general, was assassinated in Baghdad on the road of the airport by Donald Trump, this is why the political leaders in Iraq went very fast to select a prime minister that doesn't have a political weight and doesn't have a party, neither strong nor weak, really nothing. He was a former intelligence service director. He comes from a very different background. He's a journalist. He used to be hanging around the media, with nothing to do with intelligence or whatsoever. So he was selected because the Iraqi politician like to select always either a very powerful candidate that imposes himself or very weak that it can dictate their will upon him. So al-Kazimi manages in 2021 to run the elections and set up the parliamentary elections. However, the results were not to the liking of the political parties, and I explain. Muqtada al-Sadr came out with 73 MPs, the largest number of a single party, while the strong candidate to the prime ministership is the former prime minister, Noor al-Maliki. He came out with 36 MPs, a number that is extremely low to dictate his conditions or his will over any new government. However, Because many other groups were disappointed with a very low result at the elections, they all joined together, all the Shia political parties joined together, and Muqtada Sadr was on his own with a number that is higher than all of them together. However, the constitution doesn't allow him to form the government or to select a prime minister unless he has the largest group after all the MPs swear after the first session of the parliament, and all the groups can create coalition that can form the largest MPs that it has the right to select the government and the prime minister. So what happened is Muqtada Sadr manages to create a very large, the largest MP gathering by aligning himself with two powerful Sunni groups and one of the Kurds powerful group in Kurdistan led by Masoud Barzani. What happened is the federal court issued an explanation of the constitution saying the election of a president that should be the first thing to do after the election of the speaker can be done in a parliament with the majority of 220 MPs. Less than that, it is not possible to reach the quorum, and that is a mandatory number. So Muqtada Sadr went to the parliament with 73 MPs, with the coalition with the Sunni, two very powerful groups that one has 38, another one has 17, and with Masoud Barzani with 36 MPs. All these together don't make really the 220 that he needs. So he reached out to the independent group that failed him, and he managed to gather only 202 MPs on the first session of the parliament after the election of the Sunni speaker that happened a few weeks before. So this is where Muqtada became angry, and he gave all the other Shia groups. So we're talking about a problem between Shia because the Shia are the majority in Iraq. They have the right to select the prime minister. The Sunni have been allocated the speaker position, and the Kurds the president. But the executive power is the most powerful in the country and holds all the power really after the legislation power, that is the parliament. So Muqtada Sadr gave all the Shia group that gathered under the name of the coordination framework 40 days to select the government or to move to the opposition. They refused because they are aware that Muqtada Sadr can move the street against them, and if a government is formed without the Sadris, then people will go on the street and any prime minister will fail. So they said either we all go to form a government together or there is no government. We wait until you agree. There were several attempts by Muqtada Sadr to meet the coordination framework, but he has always requested to exclude former Prime Minister Noor al-Maliki that ruled Iraq twice in two terms after Jafari in 2006 and then in 2010. And we all know, we remember that this is when ISIS attacked in 2014, when Noor al-Maliki was around as a prime minister. So the 40 days went by, and the other 2 weeks went by, and week after week, month after month, Muqtada Sadr said, okay, you're not going to form the government, then I am resigning, and I ask all my MPs to pull out. So far, Muqtada Sadr behaved as a really a man of a state, a mature politician who wanted to reach out to other groups to form a government. However, when he forced all the MPs to offer resignation, this is when he made his first biggest mistake. And the big mistake is to pull out of the parliament and then immediately request the dissolution of the parliament and a new election. Now, with 73 MPs, it was very easy to gather a third of the parliament and then ask for a new parliamentary elections. Being out of the parliament reorganized itself to select the second who failed to win, and then Muqtada Sadr was out, and the coordination group was in, more powerful than ever, with a large group inside the parliament. So Muqtada Sadr opted to go to the street and ask his supporters to start the manifestation and occupy the parliament. He discovered that by occupying the parliament was a very bad idea. He asked them to camp outside the parliament. And then he started making one mistake after another, pushing the Sadrists in the street, who are very young, all of them, to go to the federal court and then to the Supreme Court and occupy the building. And the last straw that really broke to a fight, to a street fight, is when he occupied the presidential palace and the base of the government. This is when Prime Minister Mustafa Kazemi ordered the security forces for a forced evacuation of all the all the demonstrator, and this is when the Sadr started to open fire against the security forces. Now we have to keep in mind that no such a thing can happen without the consensus of Muqtada Sadr, who ordered them to defend themselves. Why we are sure about that? Because everything happened around 3 o'clock local time, and this is when the shooting started. Muqtada Sadr came out the next day around noon local time in Iraq to express his indignation, that his rejection to what's happening. It took him 20 hours to react, and there were 43 people killed and 700 wounded between the Sadrists and the security forces. So we understand, after talking to a few Sadrist leaders, myself today and yesterday, that Muqtada Sadr wanted to show a little bit his power and show that he can control the street and he can open fire and dominate the street. However, he was not able to dominate the street, yes, to create a havoc and to prove that Iraq is still not ready and to work for the national interest, and all the other political leaders in Iraq are really not mature enough to work for the support of the state and to form a government in the interest of the population.
Um, well, I guess I wasn't all that surprised that he retired from politics, because I've seen that happen before. You and I have talked about this man before. You've tried to sort of explain him to me. I still honestly don't understand what he wants, other than the thing that makes the most sense, what you just said at the end there, was, he's trying to flex his muscles, trying to show everybody that he still has the control of a lot of the populace. He claims that he doesn't want the US or Iran to have too much control over the government. That seems very logical. Al-Maliki, would he have become prime minister if not for this objection and protest by Muqtada al-Sadr?
Now, Noor al-Maliki can never return to power for one simple reason. In 2014, when he gathered the largest number of MPs, the Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani in Najaf sent a letter for the first time ever in his life on black and white, writing that al-Maliki should not return to power because al-Maliki was exclusive, turned out to be inadequate for ruling the country, and al-Maliki is really not the suitable person for Iraq not only in my opinion, but I think in the opinion of many Iraqis among politicians and the population. However, if we look at Muqtada Sadr and his request, Muqtada Sadr wants to rule Iraq, but he wants to rule it on his own. Moreover, he's claiming to find um, uh, corruption. Then we see him allying himself with Masoud Barzani, that is accused of corruption and of rejecting the request of the federal court to send the oil revenue to Baghdad. He's selling the oil since many years, and the income is in his pocket. And he's establishing relationship with Israel when Iraq declared Israel as an enemy. So he is selling the oil to Turkey without going through Baghdad and without sending the revenue to Baghdad, because the agreement, according to the constitution, that 17% of the oil revenue goes to him and the rest goes to the federal government. And the federal government hasn't received any of the oil revenue since many years. So by Muqtada Sadr saying, I want to fight corruption, and then he allies himself with people who are accused of corruption, it shows that this is really not his objective. Moreover, since 2006, Muqtada Sadr has been part of the government in Iraq. Until today, he has Sadrist ministers, he has more than 69 vice ministers, general director, ambassadors. He is in the heart of the institution. So if he is accusing the Iraqi leaders, political leaders, from corruption, he is one of them. He is not to be excluded. And he did not offer anything to the Iraqi population saying that this is my program, these are my intentions, I want to listen to everybody. I can't rule on my own, because with 73 MPs, the reason why he managed to gather the 73 MPs is, first, his population is higher than the other. However, he knew how to run the election according to the new law when the other groups failed to understand the electoral law and all the voices were dispersed. So in one particular province, for example, let's say Muqtada Sadr presented one candidate and the other group presented three candidates. And Muqtada won with a little bit higher than each one of the three, but much lower than all three together. So they really didn't understand how the electoral law functions. That's one. Two, Muqtada Sadr has 1 million voters who selected 73 MPs. There are other 7 million Shia in Iraq who did not vote for him. So he can't say, I want to rule Iraq on my own and I want to take the power and you all have to follow me. He proved when the vice speaker was selected, Hakim al-Zamili is a Sadrist, that Hakim al-Zamili pushed and elbowed the speaker, who is a Sunni, and really replaced him in all the decisions. So he has a charisma, he has the intention to rule by force, and that can't happen in Iraq today.
Can I just to contextualize this, because I remember during the Iraq invasion, his name coming up a lot. In fact, there was, if I remember correctly, at one point the U.S. was thinking of taking him out, essentially, or they had surrounded him. They had surrounded Sadr city. Is Sadr a inspirational religious figure, or my take is he kind of has a patronage network of supporters, or is it a little bit of both? I'm trying to understand where his power comes from. Is it, I think his father was a big deal, right? His father had influence, or what's the source of his power in Iraq?
The source of his power is an inheritance that he gathered from his father, Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr, who was a Grand Ayatollah with a large popularity among the poor people, particularly in the south of Iraq, in the center, and in al-Sadr city in Baghdad. So after the assassination of his father and his brothers by Saddam Hussein in 1999, he replaced his father with the the U.S. forces occupying the country in 2003. Because he was under home arrest and he was an inexperienced young man who found himself with hundreds of thousands of people supporting the family of al-Sadr, because Iraq is ruled by tribes more or less, and there is a lot of devotion to the leader, to the image of one person. So this is what he has inherited. And yes, indeed, you rightly said, in 2003 he fought against the American forces, and he was the first to fight against them, rejecting the occupation. However, after failing following the second war in Najaf, 2004-2005, he fled to Baghdad and then from there to Iran. And he stayed in Iran on and off for several years before returning permanently in 2009. So Muqtada Sadr, I know him in person because I met him several times when I lived for over 9-10 years in Iraq. Um, he's not someone who was submitted to the Iranians. He understood that a good relationship with Iran is to his benefit. Nevertheless, he accused Iran for spreading and splitting his group in different pieces because, yes, it is true that Iran supported Asaib Ahl al-Haq that are led by Qais al-Khazali, who was one of the students of Muqtada's father and one of Muqtada's lieutenant. Also, the other groups like not only Asab al-Haq, but Al-Nujaba is led by Akram al-Kabi, was a vice head of the Mahdi army, and he has his own group, and he split from Muqtada. So Iran contributed in really taking chunk of Muqtada Sadr's group, however, did not manage to weaken him because he has such a large popularity.
So, Elijah, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about this because there are a lot of Shia militias in Iraq, and so I think a lot of times in the Western press, they all get labeled as Iranian backed. And so I'm wondering, what exactly is the state of the popular mobilization forces now? Because we are, 2+ years, 2.5 years since Soleimani and Mohandas were killed. And what's their relationship with Sadr's militias, and what was their role in what happened in Baghdad this week?
The Popular Mobilization Forces were created in 2014 from all the groups that are today existing on the Iraqi arena. Muqtada Sadr has his group within the Popular Mobilization Force. It is a 313 brigade that is based in Samarra and that has a task to protect Samarra, the city in the north of Baghdad. That was the place where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS that was killed by the Americans, was born. So this is the task of Muqtada. Popular Mobilization Forces include all the forces that are on the ground. Now, when in 2018 the war on ISIS stopped and it was no longer needed to have all the militia enrolled within the different names and within the Popular Mobilization Forces, the Prime Minister Adil Abdel Mahdi, and before him was Haider Abadi, issued a decree saying that all those who want to join their own group, they can leave, and those who want to remain within the Popular Mobilization Forces can stay under the leadership of the Prime Minister. So what we have today is we have a Popular Mobilization Forces made of all the various groups that are already existing, like Asab al-Haq, Katab Hezbollah al-Iraq, Katab Shahada. All these have a separate group, but they have detached many of their men inside the Popular Mobilization Forces, maintaining an influence inside this big organization that is in theory under the leadership of the Prime Minister. So when you have clashes like the one in Baghdad, the Popular Mobilization Forces did not interfere in the clash, as Muqtada al-Sadr rightly said yesterday, because they are form of the Sadrist and non-Sadrist. They can't go into the battle because otherwise they will be split and they will start fighting among themselves, which doesn't make any sense. So they pull out from this mix of illogical fighting among the security forces. But by the way, the security forces, even the security forces, are made of Sadrist and non-Sadrist. So the whole of Iraq security forces is a bouquet of all the different groups. That's why it's very difficult to explain things to people, because you can't put a really one label on each force, because each force contains uh, many hundreds of members of different groups that are also armed, but they are split from the Popular Mobilization Forces, but they maintain a strong influence in the group. So Abu Mahdi Mohandes was the military leader, like the General Chief of Staff, but the political leader is still today existing. He is Faleh Fayyad, and there is another person who was the vice of Abu Mahdi Mohandes, who leads the Popular Mobilization Forces, that have no political role, because that is according to the constitution. They are not allowed to be part of any political activity.
Can I wait for what happened? At least how it was reported initially. I mean, there was a video that went around. The State Department, to be clear, has said this is not the case. That seemed to show helicopters evacuating the U.S. embassy, and which led to a lot of people on social media and other sort of lamenting, wringing their hands, saying this is Afghanistan all over again. But in your assessment, how serious, given this, it seems to have calmed down after, I guess, Sadr told his forces to back off. How close was this actually to toppling the government, or even putting, I guess, U.S. forces in danger? It seems like they did get into the, quote, green zone. So in your assessment, how serious was what happened?
The only embassy that was evacuated was the Dutch embassy, because it was in the heart of the fighting, and it was evacuated to the German embassy. The American embassy, it's a city itself, and it is almost impossible to break in. Secondly, there are the Golden Unit that are kind of anti-terrorist unit that protects the embassy from the outside. And after 2020, it was agreed by all the parties that nobody touches the embassy, not because it is the US embassy, because it is not allowed to attack any diplomatic mission. However, the presence of the US forces is not welcomed by many groups, because the parliament said they should leave, and the resolution was voted with 171 votes in favor of asking the government to negotiate a withdrawal. And then we have Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kazimi saying, I have negotiated and the Americans are leaving, but we have either Donald Trump and after him Joe Biden both saying we are not leaving. So this is the dilemma in Iraq, because there is a misunderstanding in Iraq by who can decide the withdrawal of the US forces. Now, the agreement for the presence of the US forces was signed by the government. At the time, it was Ibrahim al-Jafari, when ISIS occupied a third of the country. When Adil Abdel Mahdi took the request to the parliament following the assassination of Abu Mahdi Mohandes and Qasem Soleimani, because he had resigned, so he doesn't have the power to ask the US forces from leaving the country, because this is not a decision of a prime minister without full function. He needs to be fully appointed, and he was just ad interim waiting for another prime minister to be appointed. So he took the request to the parliament, and the parliament agreed and voted for the withdrawal of the US forces negotiated by the government. So it turned the ball to the government. And the government of Mustafa al-Kazemi went to negotiate the withdrawal of the US forces according to his own understanding. So when I was in Baghdad several months ago, I spoke to all the political leaders and head of MPs and ministers, and it seemed they found a way which is a bit pushing the Americans from the door and allowing them to re-enter from the window by saying, well, we don't want the Americans, but we accept NATO to be in the country. And I said, are you serious? Well, NATO is America, is commanded by the Americans, and the orders come from the Americans, and it's led by an American general. He said, well, it sounds different from saying the United States forces will stay in the country. I said, happy you, then it's fine. So nobody wants the Americans to leave for one single reason that was expressed by Donald Trump before his departure. He said clearly, you will never get the money, the oil, the money of the oil, because all the money that the Iraq, when Iraq sells the oil, all the money goes to the Bank of New York before reaching the Iraqi government. So because Iraq is under the Article 6 of the United Nations, it doesn't have the full power over the amount of money they receive from selling the oil. So Donald Trump said, you will not receive your money. And I want $9 billion for the construction of the airport that I have constructed for my forces, like in the base of Ain al-Assad and the Taji and other places. So he basically was blackmailing the Iraqis and saying, you ask me to leave, then you will starve. And I heard from the Prime Minister's office, top leaders there, saying the Iraqi population is not ready to live another sanction like during the time of Saddam Hussein in 1991, when the Food for Oil program started, and when Madeleine Albright acknowledged the famous sentence that it is worse to see 500,000 children in Iraq dying from the sanctions. So that is the reason why there is no really oomph for pushing the US forces outside the country.
There are none, it doesn't have anything to do with security. It's not that they want some backup troops in Iraq. That doesn't really have anything to do with it. It doesn't benefit them in any way. Just curious.
No, because if we see what the Americans did several times, they've attacked the Iraqi forces, the regular forces on the borders between Iraq and Syria, who were there monitoring and attacking ISIS and preventing ISIS from crossing. We don't have American forces. We haven't ever seen American forces on the borders trying to stop ISIS from crossing. On the contrary, we have the American occupying Al-Tanaf crossing between Syria and Iraq, preventing any regular forces from coming within 50 kilometers and allowing whoever wants to be in the area, offering safe haven for them. This is what we have seen. So the Americans are not injecting any forces to support the Iraqis. They say they are training, but we see that the Iraqis have gathered enough experience in fighting ISIS for many years and capable of protecting the borders and protecting the country from terrorist groups. We have seen how the Americans have refused to supply the Iraqi army with the jets that they have bought and helicopters they have bought when they were most in need in 2014. But we haven't seen, and the Americans are not allowed to be in the sky without the approval of the Iraqi government. Yet we see hundreds of convoys of oil stolen from Syria going into Iraq without the permission of the Iraqi government. We see the Americans are in the sky of Iraq without the permission of the Iraqi government. So we don't see a really full respect of the Iraqi sovereignty.
And while we're on this subject, I watched a segment on Al Jazeera, and they claimed that both the US and Iran have sort of stepped back from and not meddled in this situation over the last couple of days, mainly because al-Sadr, claims that he doesn't want them to meddle. I was kind of surprised by this and wondered if it was true.
Oh, yes, it is true, because there is no place for the Americans or for the Iranians to interfere when it is purely between the Sadrists in the street and the Iraqi security forces, where any other force can come in and do what. There is no point in doing so. Secondly, we've learned when the language of firearm dominate, there is no place for diplomacy. So the next day, when things started to cool down a little bit, the Iranian made a few calls to the Iraqis saying that an inter-Shia fight is not acceptable. Muqtada Sadr contacted the Marja'iyya in Najaf, who said exactly the same thing. And this is where all parties understood that the clash leads to nowhere. And the interference of the Americans and the Iranians doesn't make any sense, really.
And then you said that Sadr didn't do anything for roughly 20 hours. I think it was last night, which would have been, I guess, the middle of the night in Iraq. They said that he held a press conference. Actually, was it last night, or I'm probably getting my times mixed up. But first I heard that he was threatening a hunger strike. And then I guess it was last night he did a press conference where he basically ordered all of his followers to stop the protesting and exit the area within 60 minutes, or he would disown them. That's what I saw on the news. And as you know, Elijah, we don't trust our mainstream news all that much. So that's why I'm asking to verify with you. Is that what really happened?
So what happened, that is correct. What happened is the day before yesterday, the clashes started in the green zone around 2 o'clock in the afternoon local time. And then in the evening, there was an information that Muqtada Sadr started a hunger strike, believing that the Mahatma Gandhi style can work. And then the next day, he allowed 20 hours to go by before coming out and saying, I give you 60 minutes to evacuate the green zone and to stop all manifestation. And that was a great opportunity for Muqtada Sadr to come down the tree, where he climbed so high that he really needed 43 people killed and 700 wounded to find a way out, because he was in real trouble. He had no strategy and no other way to come out of this impasse that he put himself in by pulling out of the parliament, by asking his supporters to go and start camping outside the parliament and the federal court. And doing that, people in the opposition side will say, great, stay there for a year or 2 and 3, spend all your money on supporting all your people and feeding them and giving them all the support, but then zero substance. So this is why this military clash saved his face. However, he came out a loser on all sides. So the information you have is right. It happened at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the day before yesterday, and then yesterday at noon, where he came out and he said he ordered all his people to leave. He could have ordered his people to stop firing against the security forces just an hour after he has learned, or minutes after. And his people would have obeyed like they have obeyed. Within 60 minutes, everybody evacuated the green zone, which means that he was holding the power over them.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, that he's more politically savvy than his opponents and his even his colleagues. So he has a platform, right? He has access. He um, could get his message out immediately, apparently. I have one more question. Is the other speculation I've seen is um, that there may need to be a new election. That may, I guess, there are a lot of people even in the news, independent news and mainstream news, just still trying to figure out what it exactly is that he wants. I feel like I've heard this question many times over the years, and you have helped us sort it out as best anyone can do. But there's speculation that maybe new elections are the only thing that will break this logjam of finding the right leader for Iraq. But then others are saying that the election results, if there was a new election, would likely be very similar to the ones last year anyway, and wouldn't really solve anything. What are your thoughts on that?
I think he has managed to gather 73 MPs. And as I said to several Sadris in his office, in the calling for a new election, which is something that is going to happen, and everybody is going to agree on that, because nobody disagree on running new elections, because many political parties condemned the result of the election and said it was not adequate for their own reasons. So it is going to happen, maybe in a year time, maybe in 10 months, because the elections need organization. However, my question was, what if Muqtada Sadr gathered, instead of 73, 65 or 90? Or 95 or 100? You need 165 to dominate the parliament. Without 165, you don't decide. And if you don't decide, you need to go into coalition with other groups. And if you go into coalition with other groups like Barzani and like the Kurdish leader, or Muhammad al-Halbousi, the speaker, you again putting your hand with people accused of corruption. So your objective will be to rule Iraq. Now, after this experience of your people shooting at the security forces, I'm not sure how many people would like to align themselves with Muqtada Sadr. Now, if he gather 90, 80 or 90 MPs, still he needs to ask other groups to join him. Again, will the Shia group, will he ask the other Shia group to come in? The whole battle that happened is because he didn't want to ask, because he accused them of corruption that he was part of. So what's going to happen after the new election? Iraq has not reached the maturity to look for the benefit and the interest of the state. That's why if Muqtada Sadr rules, the infrastructure on Iraq is on the floor. Everything needs to be rebuilt. The electricity, there is no gas, they buy it from Iran, and electricity is not regular. This summer, the temperature reached 55, 56 degrees Celsius. So it's very hot, and there is no regular electricity in the country. The job opportunities are lacking. There are so many things to be done. Whoever will take the control of the country will have to suffer, but needs the support of the people and needs to be allowed to work. Now, Muqtada Sadr in every government, after 3 or 4 months, he asked his people to manifest and go in the street, always by saying, me, I'm president, look at me, I have the power to move the population. He has the power to bring several tens of thousands of people, not 1 million as he always claimed, but even with tens of thousands, it's already a lot and can block the work of the government and impose his will on the prime minister as he wants. So there's the time has not come yet for Iraq to be ruled according to the book.
Well, it seems like what you're describing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is basically a situation, a kind of stalemate where Sadr and his supporters are indispensable to any ruling coalition, but they're not popular or influential enough to actually have an outright majority to govern. So this, I mean, at least the way I'm thinking of it, this seems like an irreconcilable difference, especially in a coalition system, unlike in the United States where you get a majority, you can rule at least one of the institutional bodies in parliament, you need a coalition. So is there, it just seems like it's impossible to overcome that dynamic, which is he's too big to ignore, but he's not quite big enough to dominate. Is that incorrect?
That is absolutely correct.
So it seems like we're going to have some struggles going forward then if it's, so it's hard to imagine a way out of that dynamic.
Because you see, the problem is he is excluding all the other Shia group. And there is also this religious factor in Iraq. So by saying, aligning himself with the Sunni and the Kurds, now the Sunni believe that the ruling of Iraq belonged to them because Saddam Hussein ruled the country. He was a Sunni for many years, for many decades he ruled the country, and they claim to be more knowledgeable about how to run the state than the Shia, which is true. However, the Shia are the majority, and according to the constitution, the majority ruled. And Adil Abdel Mahdi, when he was a vice president, and it happened that we met over dinner together, we were sitting next to each other, and he said, well, I think we need to reopen our offices in Damascus when we were acting as the opposition group against Saddam Hussein, because we know very well how to be in the opposition, but we don't know how to rule the state. And he was really honest. And then you have the Kurds who believe that the Iraq is a spoil of war, and they can take anything because they want to be independent, yet they need the revenue to pay the salary of the Peshmerga and the employee of the government and the various institutions. So you don't really have a possibility of a Shia political leader who would go to the other Shia leaders and say, I want to rule without you, and they would allow him because they don't trust him. Because he came out and he said, I want the Americans out, however, I want them out through the United Nations. And he's completely off his head because the United Nations will never vote against the Americans because the Americans have the veto at the United Nations. Right. So he's giving it back, the ball, to the Americans. And then he wants to do all his meetings in the presence of the UN representative in Iraq, that is Janine Bastard. And she is also an employee of the United Nations that work also for the Western institutions and doesn't work for the benefit of Iraq. So why depending on her? Why depending on NATO and asking, I want NATO, if your slogan is to ask the Americans to leave? That's one. Two, if you say you want to fight corruption, well, you don't have the history of fighting corruption because you've been and you still are, up to this date, part of a state that you are fighting and accusing of corruption. And all your vice ministers and ambassadors are still in the same system. And so all his requests are putting the other side very suspicious. However, the other side are truly corrupted. And we have seen them governing Iraq for many years, and we've seen the result. So what is the solution? There is no solution but to reduce the corruption and try to be part of a government and fight the corruption within the government, from within, and expose those who are corrupted and show what they are doing and what they are not doing. This is an honest project and strategy, can be adopted, be transparent, talk to the population, but don't say I rule and nobody else.
So it seems
I'm
like
sorry.
there's maybe been a lot of opportunity for that so far, Elijah. And I'm just wondering what happens if there are no reforms. Do you think it seems like, again, you point to a lot of Sadr supporters are young men. It seems like there's a lot of youth unemployment, young men, they just don't have any jobs in Iraq. If there's not a functioning state, then there's going to be no economic recovery. And if you're just sitting in your, family's home boiling alive in absurd heat, I could only imagine what could potentially happen in Iraq. And so, is there a potential that one of these groups just goes and tries to seize power and tries to rule the country, because at least then somebody's in charge and doing something, rather than this very weak interim government that Iraq's had for a couple of years now?
That's a good question. With the presence of the popular mobilization forces, it's an ideological group that will prevent any coup d'etat in Iraq. The proposition to appoint a military person as a prime minister has been on the table in 2019 and was rejected by most political leaders. They suggest several candidates, but they were all refused because it was not the time to have a military leader who will be another dictator. Even if he's a Shia, you move from a Sunni dictator to a Shia dictator. So the point of having a coup d'etat in Iraq is excluded. Secondly, everybody has weapons. All the groups are armed, and they are really, really armed. So it is difficult even for the state to control these groups at the moment unless you have a long period of stability where there is no need to see all the groups with weapons, and there is no need to use these weapons anymore. So if there is this kind of well-being and a ruling that is really balanced for several years, then it is possible to start reform. Now, if you look at Mustafa Kazemi and Adel Abdel Mahdi, actually, they both succeeded because they had no political party behind, much more than people like Haider Abadi, who is from the Dawa party, or Noor al-Maliki from the Dawa party, or Ibrahim al-Jafari, all these former prime ministers that come from the Dawa party. They've succeeded because they had no support from political party. They were not corrupted because Adel Abdel Mahdi was not corrupted, but he was less influential over the ministers who are under Muqtada Sadr control and under Noor al-Maliki's control and under Hadi al-Amiri, who is the leader of al-Fatah group. So there is yes, it's better than other prime ministers, however, still not reaching the desired level of governing. If we bring a prime minister like Muqtada Sadr suggested, to put Jafar Sadr, who is the current ambassador in the UK, that's again another Sadrist. So you will see the Sadrist all over Iraq, because today, if you look, just to give you an idea, any personality or minister or MP, if you look at his bodyguards, they are far from being professionals. They are his brother, his cousin, the member of the family related to his wife, etc. So the whole tribe family group are around him, and they really have no clue about the job they are asked to do. A job of a bodyguard is completely different from job of to give the job to a member of the family who has never worked in his life. So not just because you trust the person that he can do the right job. Well, this is what's happening with Muqtada's entourage. All his advisors are obedient. They're not qualified. He is the only decision maker. And you can't have a leader when he is the one who wakes up in the morning and say, like the Mullah Omar, I see that Muhammad told me to leave Kabul, and then he leaves Kabul next day. So there is no counsel there are no advisors, there's no expert in different field to talk to And all the advisors that Muqtada, for example, has are members, are obedient advisors. They are not members of these families because he doesn't like members of these families to be around him. That's why he's putting Jafar al-Sadr very far at the embassy in London. But if you look at the others, they all, Noor al-Maliki had his son who was buying wheat and sugar and oil to the state. So this is the mentality.
So this looks a lot to me, and maybe it's because we're from New Jersey, but we have the old style political machines here where it's what you call nepotism, right? Where he's a buddy, he's my brother-in-law. That seems to be, like I said, when I thought of Sadr, that's what I thought, a kind of political boss who was running a patronage network, right? Loyalty to me, and I give you favors. Is that the underlying cause of some of the corruption throughout Iraq, that it's all, instead of people with merit or qualifications, everyone's getting their job within the government based on who they know and who their family members are? And is that why they don't have any experts to turn on the electricity, for instance? Is that a wide problem within the country?
That's one aspect. The other aspect is each person support his party. So this is why when I said with the case of Adel Abdel Mahdi and Mustafa al-Kazimi, they both succeeded more than others because they didn't have a party. They were selected because they were without a political support behind them. While when we see Muqtada Sadr, he has a very large group behind him. So he needs to feed these people. He needs to give job to his people. He needs to keep the flow of income coming. If you look at Noor al-Maliki, it's exactly the same. He needs to support the group. He needs to support the Dawa party because he needs to prepare for the following elections where his party needs to be wealthy enough and within where the most powerful position of the institution to be able to respond to any favors or any request the Dawa party needs. This is how things work in Iraq today.
Is there a lack of professional class? I guess let's go back to the invasion. When one of the things Paul Bremer, who was, I guess, the American viceroy or something of Iraq, did something called debathification, which he said he was modeling on the post-German denazification program. But what some critics at the time, and this seems to be borne out by what you're saying, was saying is that basically they were purging the entire professional class of Iraq because everybody had been trained and risen under the Ba'ath Party dominance. Is that still true? Has there kind of been in this post-occupation, U.S. occupation dynamic? Is it like basically the professional class is still excluded, and so is that part of this, or is that so long ago it doesn't matter?
Well, you're putting your finger really inside the wound here, because what Paul Bremer said when he started the debathification, he not only put 400,000 of the military professionals at home, and most of these joined Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which became later ISIS, but he also removed all the Ba'ath member party. Now, in Iraq, you can't have a job if you are with a certain education and university degree without being member of the Ba'ath party. So if all these people are at home and hunted down because they were member of the Ba'ath party, then what is remaining are people who belong to this tribe and his clan and this family. And this is how Iraq was built on the wrong basis since 2003, where the US forces heavily contributed in the destabilization of Iraq. And I think the Americans didn't do that out of a purpose and a strategy, but for their ignorance of how to handle Iraq, because they really didn't know. I mean, if you take Paul Bremer's book and you read it, and you see in one chapter, I was just shocked, falling off my chair when I read that George Bush, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, everybody was in a meeting, in a video conference, and they talking to Paul Bremer and said, we have decided that this is what we are going to do today, and this is the policy that you're going to follow. What do you think? And Paul Bremer said, Mr. President, I don't agree because this and that. And George Bush said, go for it. My God, one person who is key instructor without any experience, landing in Iraq, telling you, this is what I think, and then with all your staff and the administration, you tell him this is what we think, and he contradict you, and you tell him go for it, you both have no clue what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Shooting from the hip. That was George W. Shooting from the hip.
Oh my God. We're going to need to wrap up pretty soon, but I was hoping that we could talk about the JCPOA for a little bit. Kyle, I wonder if you want to take over here. You've done a lot of reporting and a lot of podcasts on this, and Eli has a pretty new article on this as well. You want to spend a few minutes talking about this just to kind of keep everybody up on what's happening with it?
I mean, I would just like to hear Elijah's take on it, because I feel like at this point the reporting on it is somewhat all over the place, where a couple of days are, you'll get a report from Al Jazeera saying a return to the deal is imminent, and then the U.S. and Iran are still going back and forth on several details going on with the Iran deal. So I felt like Elijah was probably pretty close to what's actually going on here, but there's just so many statements being made by so many officials on different levels. It does seem that Iran has really dropped the IRGC demand, but they are holding on to the demand that the IAEA close its investigations into Iran's nuclear facility. So go ahead, Elijah.
So let me explain the IRGC demand. Actually, Iran did not drop the IRGC demand and never said the IRGC or nothing. What happened is the debate between the current administration and the Iranians is that the Iranians consider that all the sanctions imposed by Donald Trump and all the sanctions imposed after 2015 should be removed. Now, Donald Trump included the IRGC and all its civilian institutions within the sanctions. And there are around 3,500 sanctions imposed on Iran. So the Iranians said, you remove all the sanctions as the deal was signed in 2015. What people miss is in 2015, Barack Obama did not fulfill his commitment and did not respect fully the JCPOA because he refused to instruct the banks in the US and in Europe to deal with Iran. That was the main point. He did not return all the Iranian money. There are still $110 billion in several banks in different countries, frozen by these countries, and these were not returned to Iran. So the point today is to lift all sanctions. However, the other point that Iran offered is saying, if you cannot give us the guarantee that this JCPOA is going to hold even for 2 years or after you, then we are not going to pour cement in the Iraq nuclear facility, and we are not going to give up on our advanced centrifuge that, according to JCPOA, they are allowed to have the first generation when Iran has reached the sixth and the ninth generation. So this is the debate today, is what are the guarantees that Iran can have to keep all its capability, not knowledge, because the knowledge, Iran has the knowledge to make the bomb if they want to. They have reached the 60%, and between 60 and 90 is really a joke. The main difference, the main problem was from 1 to 20, and between 20 and 60 is easier, and 60 to 90 is much easier. So the knowledge is there. If the Americans don't trust the Iranians and vice versa, which is the case, then putting things on black and white is even not enough, because we've seen what Trump did in 2018. Even when it was on black and white, he shredded the deal and he started to impose sanctions on Iran, the harshest ever. So the Iranians are not dropping really the IRGC request. They're saying you lift all the sanctions. However, if you think, this is how they speak to the European, to the Americans via the European, if you think that you want to keep the IRGC Quds Brigade on a list of terrorism because of its activity in the Middle East, you can keep it. That is not a problem, and we are not going to insist on it because this is not going to change anything from the Iranian influence that is already established in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Therefore, this is not going to be an obstacle. However, now the Americans are raising again the issue of the three sites that Barack Obama dropped in 2015, and that is related to the information that is coming from Israel. And the Iranians are extremely upset, saying, if we sign a deal and you don't solve this issue, tomorrow you're going to say, well, I signed a deal, but you need to comply because we still have the issue of the three sites where there are traces of uranium and you haven't given a satisfaction to the IAEA in your answers. Therefore, the sanctions are imposed and they will remain. That was a phone call. Sorry.
Oops. Oh, okay, good. I was just we didn't lose you.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's back.
Sorry?
No, I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. I said he's back.
Yeah, I just received a call and I just put the phone down.
Yeah.
So this is the level where they have reached. Iran is saying we'll return to the JCPOA, all of us, or we don't. So you can't say yes, but there is a still unresolved issue that was solved in 2015, which means you're not serious. By saying you're not serious, what Iran is doing today? First of all, Iran has enough uranium, enriched uranium, to much more than that is allowed in the JCPOA, but less than what it has reached before 2015. Secondly, it has advanced centrifuge that enable it to produce more purity uranium than ever before and is in a strong position. And third, Iran is selling 1.4 million barrels of oil per day, not to Europe. So if Europe is in need of 2.5 million barrels per day, it is up to them to push for the JCPOA. Otherwise, yes, there is a 41.5% inflation in Iran, but there are 79.8% inflation in a NATO country like Turkey and 21.2% in Latvia. This is a member of the European Union, and soon the UK will follow and other European countries after September with the shortage of gas and the inflation that is growing. So the Iranians are saying, well, if you want the JCPOA and you want to make sure that we are not going to make the bomb, come and get it, but this is not going to be only on your terms, it's going to be on in an area where we both stand and we both happy and we both winner.
So the conflict in Ukraine is giving Iran a better negotiating position in this? Is that, I followed you?
Well, the Saudi Arabia and OPEC members have increased their production to 690,000 barrels per day. This is more or less the quantity that Americans used to receive from Russia, 700,000, and Europe can stuff itself at the end of the day. That's the American logic. At the end of the day, Europe is in shortage of gas, is buying the gas liquefied from the US with 40% extra from what it was costing it from Russia. It is looking for other sources in Algeria, in Kazakhstan, from Qatar, and it's really begging for oil, gas and oil that is not getting. Europe is in need of 155 million cubic meters, and America can offer 10 million cubic meters.
So the Europeans will then in terms, they're parties to the agreement. I guess it's really the U.S. as the major roadblock, but you're saying they're going to be agitating even stronger because of their energy needs. Does that make sense?
Well, they have this tool. Venezuela also has oil, but Biden visited Venezuela and said, we allow you to reproduce the oil and we buy it. And said, what about the sanctions? He said, well, this is something completely different. We're not ready to negotiate. So Nicolas Maduro said, hasta luego, not interested.
Yeah, I hope that doesn't hold. We're going to need to be more.
It'll be a long winter.
We're going to need to become a little bit.
Yes.
Not a little
Yes.
bit, a lot more easy to, more cooperative. Let's put it that way. Well, we're just past an hour now, and so we should wrap up. But before we do that, Elijah and everybody, please let us know where to best find your work, how to support your work, and all that good stuff. Elijah, if we could start with you.
Well, if you put my name on Google, you will find my website. And if you subscribe, I will be very grateful.
And you're still fairly active on Twitter, right?
Yes.
How about Telegram?
No, I don't have the time on many platforms, really. Even from Twitter, I'm not very present every single day, but I keep an eye from time to time.
That's great. And Kyle, want to tell everybody how to follow you, how to support you?
Yeah, I'm Kyle Anzalone, opinion editor at antiwar.com, news editor at the Libertarian Institute, co-host of Conflicts of Interest, and everything I do ends up at my Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_.
And then we have Dan, the co-founder of Around the Empire, who's going to start his own show soon. So I don't know if you want to talk about that yet, Dan, but just let everybody know how to keep in touch with you and how to support you.
You'll see me on Around the Empire sometimes, and then on Twitter as well, DSW_XYZ.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, everybody. I really enjoyed it. I appreciate the time to give us all this good info, and it's great to see everybody, of course.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Elijah Magnier, Kyle Anzalone, and Dan Wright. Follow Elijah on Twitter at EJMALRAI, EJMALRAI. Find and support his work on his website, ejmagnier.com, where you can read his work, subscribe, and donate. Follow Kyle on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_ and at con_interest. Find his writing at Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, and on Patreon. Follow Dan on Twitter at DSW_XYZ. This is a fully independent podcast, and in this age of censorship and suppression, your support's more important than ever. Go to the website aroundtheempire.com. You can find the various ways that you can get access to bonus content, support the show, and you can find all the different platforms that we're on. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave reviews. Those things really help us. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire. Join us on Telegram, t.me/AroundTheEmpire. And we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody. Stay strong.